tonight when he will take questions. Thank you for recording, Barb, if that was you. I always forget. Martin,
apparently.
He will leave a couple of gaps and invite questions periodically throughout tonight. So hold your questions until then. And of course, after he wraps up, we'll do a full Q&A session with him afterwards. So everybody, please welcome Martin Mika.
All right. So had been doing this for a while, and I thought I would share with everybody the results. And one of the reasons that I've been using camera lenses is simply because they're there. If you have a camera that you're walking around with and doing daytime photography, you can do astrophotography with it. And I wanted to explore the limits of how far we could go with that. And I'm sure you guys have seen the rigs that some of the members have. I don't know if you see my screen or not, but I'm talking about using something like this. This lens is as small as this little baby lens that I have here, all the way up to lenses like this that are getting into telescope territory. I'm gonna admit I'm a little biased. Bigger is better, but part of that's a magnification thing. But we will explore a little bit of everything, and as well as a couple of things that lenses do well, things that lenses don't do well, and you might want a telescope for, and some examples of different ways to overcome some of the challenges and the different type of results you can expect. I'm gonna apologize if any photos are washed out or pixelated. Everybody's monitor is a little bit different. I did a lot of this here on my work computer, so it is calibrated for that, and it's not the best one. But if anybody does want raw versions of the photos to play around with later, or any other information after the talk, you can feel free to email me or ask questions. So let's start with why we would want to use a camera lens versus a telescope. Well, a couple of things. I mean, telescopes are great at magnifying some objects. With magnification of tiny objects comes the need for really good tracking, comes the need for longer exposures, comes the need for heavy mounts. And that all adds cost, it adds time, it adds patience. Camera lenses, you already have them. If you're using a DSLR camera, you have a lens attached to it. So why not start there? Now you'll see the focal length difference is quite significant. There are lenses longer than 300 millimeters, but generally between 10 and 300 millimeters, whereas telescopes just start at around the 300 millimeter mark. The focal ratio, which is the ratio of the aperture to the focal length, you've got telescopes are generally slower. Lenses can be a lot faster than telescopes, and we'll discuss in a little bit how that helps in astroimaging. Lenses are generally lighter. They are generally, I have an asterisk there, cheaper, because there is a point at which they become ridiculously expensive, and you are better off with a telescope. You can use them for daytime photography. Unlike your telescope, if you are doing birding or long distance shooting, you can probably get away with using a telescope, but it's probably not something you'd carry around for everyday or family pictures. Downside is you can't really hook an eyepiece up to a camera lens, and you probably don't want to. You have a viewfinder for that. So you might think, okay, that's great. Well, let's look at a couple of a really quick comparison here. This is a photo of the Dumbbell Nebula. The one on the left is taken with my 12-inch reflector. The one on the right with a 300 millimeter camera lens. You can say, okay, so what? The telescope is better. The telescope gives a more resolute image. The telescope gives a better image. It's more pleasing. It fills the field of view. Why would I want to use a camera lens? Because that object is tiny and kind of pointless looking. Well, we'll get to that. Not every object benefits from being shot with a camera lens. So some advantages of lenses. You can use them for everyday photography. They're lightweight, they're short focal length, so you don't have to have a massive mount. And as we know, the mount is the most important part of astrophotography, so you can't skimp out on the mount. Typically, fast focal ratios mean very short exposure times. So with a fast lens, you can generally get a lot deeper of an image with less exposure time. You're riding on a smaller mount if you're using a mount at all. And because you're getting a brighter image and you're able to get more light for that same exposure time, it means you don't have to crank up your ISO or your gain and try to get an image at the expense of making it grainy. You can take your time and take slower exposures. And generally, because you have them on your camera, they are cheaper to start with than buying a scope and buying a mount and buying all that gear. Some disadvantages. Just like we saw with the dumbbell nebula, you have a pretty wide field of view. With that wide field of view, you're not going to be zooming in on galaxies and getting awesome galaxy shots. They are meant for larger swaths of Milky Way, big star clusters, large nebulae, and things like that. Now, I'll touch on this at the end. You can use an astro camera. If you are a CCD person, you have a nice, cool monochrome camera, and you want to use that, there are ways to hook up a good camera lens to an astro camera as well. Another disadvantage is that lenses are designed for daytime photography, not astro. Especially zoom lenses make many optical compromises to be able to get a lot of things at a variety of distances from the viewer, and generally are not designed to shoot point sources at infinity very well. And that's what stars are. Stars are one of the most taxing tests of a lens's optical quality. Just one example is chromatic aberration. We know when we deal with lenses, like when we deal with refracting telescopes, chromatic aberration will be there unless you're using a very high quality glass. And high quality glass obviously comes at a higher price. The lens mounts are designed for one type of camera system, whereas you can slip a camera and an eyepiece and all sorts of things into your telescope. They're all pretty standardized. Canon lenses work with Canon cameras, Nikon lenses work with Nikon cameras. And usually when somebody is a Canon user, I'm a Canon user. There's nothing wrong with any of the others. I just happen to have a huge set of Canon lenses, and that's one of the reasons I'm a Canon user. It will take a lot of money for me to have to rebuy all of those lenses in a different format. So lenses will work with pretty much one type of camera, although there are adapters, because there are some gems that only one manufacturer makes, and it might be worth getting an adapter, but generally they don't work very well. And lenses that approach telescopes' focal length and sizes can be very expensive and heavy. You're better off getting a scope if you want a monster telephoto spy lens that can see people from 100 miles away. You're better off with a telescope at that point. And I'm going to make a couple of assumptions in this talk, and they may not be favorable to everybody, but that's just how it is. So one of them is that you're using a DSLR camera. DSLR cameras have interchangeable lenses. A point and shoot camera has a fixed zoom lens, so something like on your phone or a pocket camera. That's not what we're talking about here. You can do astrophotography with those. I've seen iPhone astrophotography with special mounts, but that's not what we're going to be talking about here. Same with dedicated astro cameras. Those generally are designed to be used with a telescope. You can connect a lens to them, but that's going to be outside of the scope of this talk, because I'm going to be focused on what you can do with your camera. The other assumption is that your DSLR is astro modified or has the capability of recording H-alpha. So most cameras have a filter, because camera silicon detectors are very sensitive to infrared light. They have a filter that blocks out infrared light and also blocks out a significant portion of red light. And this includes the H-alpha wavelength, which is a very common wavelength in astrophotography. A lot of nebulae emit at this wavelength. So the assumption is to get some good images, you do want an astro modified camera or a camera that records H-alpha. You don't necessarily have to have a camera that's modified by removing that filter to record H-alpha, but not every camera does. Some are more sensitive than others, some have wider filters than others. And that's kind of done on a case-by-case basis. I have had good luck with unmodified cameras in some cases. I have had others that do not pick up any H-alpha. And I'm going to be focusing on Canon DSLRs because I am a Canon user. I added Nikon with an asterisk because Canon and Nikon are the big two, or were the big two manufacturers for many decades. And therefore, there's always a Nikon version of any lens that Canon makes and vice versa. They're big competitors. They have very similar lineups when it comes, especially to their older lenses. Also, one of the reasons I initially selected Canon was that they were the first to introduce some specific accessories and modifications to do astrophotography with DSLRs. At the beginning, extra filters and accessories were primarily for Canon, but Nikon eventually followed suit. And there's nothing wrong with other makes besides these two. Nowadays, you can get those kind of accessories for pretty much anything. If you're a Pentax or a Sony user, those accessories are out there. It's just not how it started. And like I said, I'm in that Canon camp and it's too expensive to switch over. All right, so a couple of lenses that we have. These are just examples of what you'd be looking at in a general Canon catalog, and Nikon would have a very similar lineup price-wise and focal length-wise. So a standard focal length is between 24 and 50 millimeters, depending on what you like to shoot. 10 millimeters is very, very wide. 107 degrees is a pretty large field of view. That's about a third of the sky you can fit into that lens. It's a nice, very cheap lens you can add on for about $300. Most people's kit lenses are usually in the 18 to 55 kind of range, and they are zoom lenses. These are lenses that are decent for astrophotography that I have tried. Notice zoom lenses, except for that one, are generally not on here. And that's because zoom lenses make even more optical compromises to be able to zoom in and out at different focal lengths. So because of that addition to zooming, with a few exceptions, most of them are not as good as prime lenses. Prime lenses are those that have a fixed focal length. And generally, prime lenses have a much wider aperture. So they vary in price, they vary in range. I boldened the 50 millimeter 1.8 because everybody makes a 50 millimeter 1.8. It's a great lens to start with to see if this kind of astrophotography is for you. Used, they can be found under $100. They're kind of cheap in plastic, but you can buy two, and if you break one, you can just throw another one on there. At the high end is that 300 millimeter Canon that I had, no pun intended. And when that was new, that was a $7,000 lens. I didn't buy it for anywhere close to that. It was beaten up, it was taken on safari, and it's in very rough shape, and it's about 25 years old, and I got it for well under $1,000 on eBay. So there are bargains to be found. I would recommend those starting with a longer focal length to try a 200 millimeter 2.8. Every company seems to make one of those as well. Both Canon and Nikon have excellent examples. But here's the extreme example on the other end. As far as camera lenses go, this is one of the biggest. It's a Canon 1200 f5.6. So that means it has an aperture over 200 millimeters. So you can think of this as an 8+ inch refractor, and I don't even know what you would call it, a dodecuplet or something like that. It has at least 12 elements in it. It's extremely heavy. It is extremely expensive. Apparently only 5 copies of this exist in the world. Nat Geo owns 2, Sports Illustrated owns 1. I think the NSA might own another one, and I'm not sure about the other, but yeah, in the comparison and the review that I got this image from, they were able to shoot images of people on the other side of those buildings and see their hair color and everything. But for this price, you can easily have a telescope that blows this away, set your telescope up in a tripod and get even closer on the building. So these are very specialized things, and also outside the scope of, well, affordability for pretty much anyone except for a government agency. So now let's take a look at some telescopes. These are just some decent scopes for astrophotography, more like starter scopes on the left. You can see that you can get a decent astrophotography scope for about $300, pretty light. I've had one of these William Optics. It's a great scope. But when you look at the focal length, Okay, 400 millimeters, that's pretty decent. The focal ratio though, 5.9 compared to that lens that's a 2.8, that's pretty slow. And I'm going to show you an example of why that matters. You can step up to something like an Orion ED80, or even better, a 5-inch. Explore Scientific is on the low end of the 5-inch appos. And you're still looking at about a 7.5 focal ratio, still much slower than a camera lens. Okay, so let's say you want a faster scope. The ones on the right are going to be on the faster end of telescopes. These are all going to be mirror telescopes. They're going to be reflectors, which come with their own issues like collimation and coma. You don't get chromatic aberration though. You'll see that they're much, much heavier than any of those camera lenses, so you're going to need to worry about a much bigger mount. They're generally also a little more expensive, except for something like an Orion Newtonian, but again, the weight for that Newtonian, you're going to want a mount like a CGEM or a CGE Pro to do astrophotography with that, and now you're talking about a mount that's in the $2,000–3,000 price range. Two that kind of come close to camera lens performance are these f2.8 astrographs that are coming out and the Takahashi Epsilon. But again, we're looking at a much higher price range and a significant weight penalty. So I'm going to take a second and see if anybody has any questions right off the bat. Just a little bit of an overview.
Hey, Martin. I've been reading about clear aperture, how important clear aperture is for the lens, for light gathering. I'm still not clear as to what exactly the clear aperture. Is that just the measurement across of the front lens?
I believe it is. I'm actually not familiar with that term for lenses. Generally used for mirrors if you have something like a secondary mirror. But I'm not sure about lenses. They may be referring to the actual aperture versus the aperture you are stopped down to. So if I have a lens that has a 70 millimeter aperture and I'm stopping it down to 5.6, which would make the effective, I don't know, 30 or something like that, that may be what they're talking about.
Since they say it's not the iris, it's the aperture. And I find that totally not clear.
I'm going to have to look that one up and then I'll get back to you.
Okay, thanks.
Any others? All right, so I think a good place to start with camera lens astrophotography, and I'm sure many people have tried this because you have a camera, why not take a picture of the sky? Is just put it on a tripod and let's take pictures of the stars. Well, so the downside of that is that the Earth is rotating and stars will trail. That's why telescopes have tracking mounts. And you're going to have the same issue with a camera lens. However, with a camera lens, due to the shorter focal length, you can usually get away with exposures that you couldn't with a telescope, at least to get some photos of the sky. And I have a couple of calculations here. Generally, we use, or photographers use the rule of 500, which is 500 divided by your focal length, or your effective focal length, is about how much exposure time you can afford before you start seeing star trails. It also depends on how much you crop your image. I can have pictures, and in many cases do, that look great on a tiny screen. I try to print them out and they look awful. You see a lot more aberrations, a lot more details that you don't want to see when you magnify, and that goes for anything. But in general, the longer your focal length, the shorter your exposure time goes before you see star trails, before the Earth's rotation becomes a problem. If you have a full frame camera, that's a larger chip versus a crop frame. Because the chip is larger, it doesn't magnify as much. You have a wider fielded view. Then you can expose a little longer. So here's just an example. So here's a image from YRS of Scorpius and the summer Milky Way. So here's the summer Milky Way. Our core of the galaxy is right around there, below the trees. We got Scorpius here, the fishhook, star Antares, a lot of beautiful dust lanes around there. So this was a image at 10 millimeters. So it's the widest lens I have. And it was a 60-second exposure, so 1 minute. You see in the corners, the stars are streaks, but that has nothing to do with star rotation. That's a lens distortion. And again, that's why zoom lenses are usually a worse choice than prime lenses. They have more distortion. In this case, this is called a pincushion distortion, where things at the edges are pointing toward the center. You can also get barrel distortion when things at the center are sort of smushed out. And if you look up, you can look it up online. They have test charts for all of these lenses, and you can see how good or poor the lens that you're interested in performs by looking up these test charts. So, okay, that's a great wide shot of the Milky Way. Well, I want to go a little closer. Let's zoom in there. I'll switch to a 40 millimeter lens. So here's a 40 millimeter lens, and I've got a 30-second exposure. Now you can already see stars trailing. I've definitely exceeded my rule of 500 number. So 40 seconds is too much, which is a shame because there are some beautiful dust lanes here. I can see a little bit of the Rho Ophiuchi Nebula here. There's a nice globular cluster, M4, next to Antares, but this is pretty much an unusable shot because the Earth is rotating. So how much do I have to slow down? Well, a 10-second exposure at 40 millimeter, I can get pretty usable stars. Obviously, I'm doing only 1/3 the exposure time, so everything's going to be a lot darker. I'm catching a lot less light. Now, I could always stack these and process them and get more detail that way, but as much as possible, I'm trying to show you guys the results straight from the camera with very minimal editing. One thing to bear in mind too is if you're not using a mount at all, you are going to get rotation of the field because you are not equatorially aligned. You'd need an equatorial mount to be able to stack images without having to rotate them frame to frame. That's a subject for another talk. So let's see what I can get if I zoom in as much as I can. I'm going to use my 200 millimeter lens. Here's a 10-second exposure at 200 millimeters. See a lovely globular cluster here, but unfortunately the Earth is running away from me, and 10 seconds at 200 millimeters is far too much. Let's try 5 seconds. And still getting some star trails at 5 seconds. 2.5 seconds looks great. I get pinpoint stars, but I'm just not letting in enough light at all to really make anything usable of this. And I can throw this in Photoshop. I can try to stretch the levels and see what I can get out of it. Yeah, it's pretty messy. It's pretty grainy. I wouldn't do much with that. So what else can I do? Well, I can take that 40 millimeter image and I can crop it. So I had good round or roundish stars at 40 millimeters at 10 seconds. I can crop that. But of course, I have a 40 millimeter lens. That's a teeny tiny aperture at f2.8. So that's about 14 millimeter. You probably would not buy a telescope that has less than 1 inch of aperture if you wanted to do astrophotography. This 200 millimeter lens has about 5 times that, and it shows the resolution is greater. When I'm cropping, I'm just really down at the pixel level, and it's pretty much unusable to crop. So at this point, I really do want a tracking mount. And even when you're just using a camera lens, we're not talking telescopes at all, you probably still want to buy a basic tracking mount. And there are several that are very good choices for $500 or less. I personally use the Ioptron Sky Guider, and it's great. It can hold up to 11 pounds, which is quite a bit. And I think my heaviest lens is just under that. So everything works out just fine. And it fits in an airplane bag, and you can take it with you, and you can track the sky and get several minutes worth of exposures with that. So some other things that we want to look at with lenses and where you might have to treat your astrophotography differently than if you're using a telescope. So those of you who have used refracting telescopes probably know about chromatic aberration. Lenses have several other distortions that you have to worry about, and so do telescopes, and that includes any of these. Some are better than others. Some are much, much worse than others. Generally, the more expensive a lens, the better corrected it'll be. But again, lenses are designed for daytime photography, so they usually make compromises to work well at daytime photography type distances and focal lengths. They're not necessarily geared towards stars. So some telescopes actually will also have these cheap telescopes. I'm sure we've all had our first telescope. Maybe some of us have tried astrophotography with it. I have. It was a disaster. So some telescopes perform pretty badly as well. It's all on a case-by-case basis. A couple of diagrams on some of the terms that you may see used in lenses and describing their aberrations. So you have coma, and coma is generally the curvature of the lens causing rays from different points of the lens to focus at different areas. This is especially true near the edges of an image. You may have an image where stars are pinpointed at the center, and then they get these little comet shapes, or sometimes they look like bat wings on the edges. That's due to coma. You can get spherical aberration, which is where rays from the outside of a lens focus further out than the rays from an inside of the lens. You can get astigmatism, which is usually not terrible of an issue with lens. Usually chromatic aberration is a bigger issue, but a lot of these aberrations follow one another. And if you have chromatic aberration, the other ones tend to manifest themselves. You can get field curvature, and of course, chromatic aberration. And here's a little graphic of what chromatic aberration actually is. So many different wavelengths of light have different refractive indices, which is a different amount of bending, if you will, in glass. And that causes blue light to focus at a different point than red light. And you may hear telescopes be called achromatic or epichromatic, doublets, triplets, quadruplets, sextuplets. Generally, those are added elements which have different refractive indices, different amounts of bending of those wavelengths, and mating two different types of glass can unbend those light rays, if you will, and cause them to focus closer together. A single lens on this chart on the left in blue is pretty terrible. An achromat, so it's usually two lenses at most, gets kind of a good approximation of visible light altogether. An epichromatic telescope, those are usually triplets or very, very good doublets, in sometimes quadruplets. They tend to focus all of the visible wavelengths very, very well. Still kind of fall apart in UV and IR. And then you have super achromats, which are designed for UV and IR. So to focus wavelengths that our cameras may be picking up, but our eyes don't. There are a couple of things we can do when we have lenses that are showing these distortions. Stepping the aperture down usually helps. When you're taking a lens that's f2 and you're shooting it wide open at f2, that's great, we're getting a lot of light, but all of those aberrations, you're using the entirety of the lens, all those aberrations are showing up, and your photo may not be what you want. You'll have a better luck if you step it down one or two stops. Full f-stop, by the way, for those who aren't, I'm not going to get too much into photography terminology, but a full f-stop, f2, f2.8, f4, those are called full f-stops. Each stop is 1/2 the light gathered. So you can then, you would have to do, you'd have to raise the ISO to compensate, and then you get a grainier image. Sometimes you can use a smaller chip. Lenses generally fall apart in their edges. If you're only using the center of a lens, then you're using the best part of the lens as it will, and you won't have so many aberrations. This is why sometimes the crop sensor cameras rather than full frames perform better on both lenses and telescopes, because they're not so demanding in terms of the size of the field where they need everything to be perfectly corrected. The one catch is that usually an APS-C camera, a smaller camera, you have the same amount of pixels. In a smaller sensor, those pixels are smaller and the lens can fall apart in terms of resolution. You can always crop, like I showed earlier. That doesn't always work. Sometimes you are just zooming in on all the gunk. You can also use software. A lot of these cameras have built-in lens corrections. They may work very well for daytime photography, but they may cause you a lot of trouble in astrophotography. So I would suggest don't use them until after you've taken your images, and do corrections later in software. So also lenses, we're talking about doing extremely wide field astrophotography. So there are things besides your equipment that you have to worry about, like light pollution, clouds, moonlight, sky glow. You get an uneven illumination of the sky. You're looking at a much larger piece of sky rather than a teeny tiny bit. So things like this will show up in photos much more so than when you're using a telescope. Also, you have a bigger chance of things like fireflies, aircraft, satellites coming through your image. Those can all be post-processed out if you're good at it. It's not as easy as just erasing them. All right, so I am going to show a couple of images and illustrate how to take a couple of pictures and improve them or worsen them with a pretty mediocre lens. If there's any other questions beforehand, I can take a minute to answer. All right, hearing none. So I have this old Canon 28mm 1.8. 1.8 is a super fast lens. No telescope will ever get there. I throw this on my camera just for walking around because it's a pretty good general field of view. It's great for low light situations, and it's a kind of do everything lens. It has a lot of great features. Unfortunately, it also has a lot of terrible features that should manifest themselves very poorly for astrophotography. So I'm going to start myself out at a little bit of a handicap here and see what this can do. There's terrible chromatic aberration, terrible coma, and it's pretty soft if I have the aperture all the way open. Now I'm also using a telescope that's a camera that's a full spectrum camera. So not only do I have to worry about visible light, but I have to worry about UV and IR light coming to focus too. You guys shouldn't have that problem, so this is truly a worst case scenario. Just a little bit about how this lens looks. Imagine a telescope has one or two lenses at the front, and that's about it. Well, here we have tons of different lens elements inside to correct all of these aberrations, or at least to try to do a good job of correcting all these aberrations, whether you're imaging something a foot in front of you or miles away. On the left is what's called an Mtf chart, and these are available for all lenses. And they'll kind of show you how the lens performs at the edges versus at the center. And generally we want smooth lines and we want flat lines. I'll show you later why this is important. So I did a 30-second exposure of the Cygnus constellation. I was piggybacked on a telescope, so I didn't have to worry about tracking a star trailing, kept the same ISO, same camera, same settings, just used different aperture. So here's a picture at f8 of the Cygnus constellation. We see Deneb, we see Satyr, Albireo, that's the cross of Cygnus. Okay, we got some stars, great. Not impressive for 30 seconds. Open the aperture to 5.6. Now we get twice the light in the same exposure. Starting to see some Milky Way. f4, definitely starting to see some Milky Way. f2.8, Milky Way and sky glow / light pollution. At f2, even more, starting to see the North American nebula up there popping out and some other bits of nebulosity. And then full-blown 1.8, 30 seconds, you see how much more light I've gathered by opening that aperture up. What else have I gathered? Okay, so here's a crop from the center. These are pretty bad stars. That is as focused as it gets, but the UV and IR light this is a very poor lens in terms of chromatic aberration. None of that's coming to focus. These are as sharp as those stars are going to get. And look at those edges. Those are corners. I've got the little bat wings. I've got streaked out stars. If I wanted to print this out on my wall, it would look awful. Even zoomed in on a computer screen, it looks pretty awful. Right, well, let's look at the 2.8 image. Okay, my stars got a little smaller. That coma is still there, that's not going away. F4, coma is slightly better. The stars in the middle are almost usable. F5.6, coma is still there. I'm starting to get pinpoint stars in the center except for the few brighter ones. And at F8, I have pretty much usable stars except for the brightest one in the center. Still a tiny bit of coma, and again, that's mostly because I'm picking up IR light and UV light. So it will be a little better if I didn't have a full spectrum camera, so your results should improve. Nevertheless, we couldn't get rid of the coma completely. But you could see that we did quite a bit by stepping down the aperture. So there are consequences to those really fast lenses and fast apertures. Just because they perform adequately in daylight, and some of these don't, even wide open, doesn't mean they'll perform well in astrophotography. You can generally correct by stepping down the aperture. You can sometimes crop the image, or you can just use a telescope, but now we've kind of defeated the purpose of using our handy dandy camera lens and we have to go out and buy a telescope. Because what's the point of taking our 1.8 lens and stopping it down to f8? Telescope is generally faster. Well, let's try a better one. So here's a 100mm f2, same size, same weight. So this is something I can easily toss on my camera, put on a little sky tracker mount and have no problems whatsoever. This Mtf chart in the middle is for this 100mm lens versus the 28mm on the right. You can see how much better this is. Smooth lines all the way to the edges, and then things start to fall off. None of these crazy waves going on here, which if you're really into optics and engineering, you can look at these charts all day and you'll be able to tell whether they cause coma or spherical aberration or other things like that. But in general, just know that you're looking for flat, smooth drop off to the edges and none of this stuff. So let's try this guy. So here's Cygnus again, and I've zoomed in on the North America Nebula region because it's a pretty interesting part of the constellation. I've started at f4. So this is a little bit stopped down to try to get good stars. And my stars are pretty decent. I'm just getting this chromatic aberration from UV and IR light, which none of them are going to be corrected for. Even if you have a stock camera that hasn't been modified, you could probably use a light pollution filter or use a UV IR cut filter that would make it a little better. But this is a much better image. My corners look pretty good. f2.8, get a much brighter image. That same 30 seconds, I'm gathering twice the amount of light. Stars are a little more bloated. Corners still look good. And then wide open, f2, getting 4 times as much light as I did at f4. Some of those stars near the edges are a little flat, a little stretched out, and I'm getting a lot more purple halos from the chromatic aberration. But in general, this is nowhere near as bad as that 28mm 1.8. So just because a lens has the focal length you want or the aperture you want doesn't mean it's good for astrophotography. There are some gems out there. There's some real stinkers. This is nowhere near one of the best astrophotography lenses, but it's way better than that other one. You may have a lens that you don't use at all in daytime photography. It may just be good for astro. So we do see much nicer results with that lens. And it kind of relates to that chart we saw. A good way is also to look at reviews. If you're not sure, if you want to buy an astrophotography lens rather than you don't have any in your collection, or you want to buy a lens that you also want to use for astrophotography, don't just look at test charts, read reviews. Here are a couple of reviewers that actually have very thorough data on their websites showing performance at all apertures for all of these lenses. All right, and I'm getting to the end of my talk, but I'll leave a minute or two for a couple more questions in case any came up. All right.
Wait.
Yep. Gotcha.
Filters. What filters can be used without astro modifying your camera? Anything?
I will actually get to that. That's coming
Okay,
up.
cool.
Any others?
Martin, for a full spectrum camera, do you recommend using an IR cut filter that gets rid of the longer wavelengths?
Yes, I would. And only because even the best lenses you can get that have tons of elements and may be suitable for IR photography are not going to be suitable for taking all of those wavelengths from UV to IR and focusing them all at one point. So you can do IR photography with most any lenses, but that's IR only. When you mix IR and visible, you need a pretty well-designed lens to hit all those wavelengths. And that's where mirror telescopes, so that's where that Takahashi Epsilon, which does cost 3 times as much as the lens I was using, has the advantage because that's all mirrors and all the wavelengths will focus evenly.
Oh, good point. Yeah. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I experimented around a little bit, and there is another thing that we can do to improve the performance of our lenses, and that is by using narrowband filters. So just a little bit of background on narrowband imaging. So narrowband imaging involves using filters that let through only a very narrow set of wavelengths, between 3 and 12 nanometers, depending on the filter. And what we are trying to do is take a wavelength of light that's being emitted by the object we're interested in. Generally, this is hydrogen because the universe is made up almost entirely of hydrogen. And we are trying to let in light only from that wavelength. And the effect that has is it brings out things that are normally hidden in sky glow and light pollution and star clusters, and shows not only these hidden nebulae, but enhances their contrast. You're getting the same amount of light from the nebula in a wide spectrum unfiltered image, but that light is generally drowned out by everything else. Using a narrowband filter lets you let only that wavelength of interest in from that nebula. Now, this generally applies only to nebulae. It can help in some cases in galaxies, but mostly nebulae, since they are clouds of glowing gas and we're looking for that emission. Stars are broadband objects. They're essentially black bodies. Galaxies are mostly clouds of stars. They do have some nebulae. That's why I said it can sometimes be applicable to galaxies, but in general, galaxies do better with other techniques. So hydrogen has 2 wavelengths that are in the visible. We can argue whether H gamma is visible or UV, but in general, you'd be looking at H alpha and H beta. H beta, because it's blue, it has a higher frequency. It is generally caused by higher energy processes, so nebulae will emit a lot less of it. Mostly what you're looking for is H alpha. There are tons of H alpha objects in the sky. The downside is that it's in the deep red, almost in the near infrared region. So those camera filters that keep us from seeing infrared light are going to suppress H alpha. Now, that doesn't mean that a stock unmodified camera, even with a blocking filter, can't detect H alpha. With a long enough exposure, most DSLR cameras can pick up H alpha, but sometimes the exposure time becomes prohibitive. So you can do either a full spectrum mod, which is getting rid of the filter entirely and letting your camera see all sorts of wavelengths, or doing an astro mod, which lets the camera see a little bit deeper into the red, but still allows you to use it for daylight photography just by changing the white balance a little bit. If you're letting in infrared light, you get all sorts of weird things, and that's also a topic for a different talk that I'd be happy to give at some point. So, okay, we've got some red, some blue. Well, red nebulae are pretty. If we want to make a full color image, we will add other things like oxygen, for example, which emits in the green, and have a filter for each of those wavelengths, and then combine them as a color image. You make one red, one green, and one blue, and then you have a color image out of that. Now, generally, because it lets only wavelengths from nebulae through, those narrowband filters will also suppress moonlight and will suppress excessive starlight and light pollution. One caveat is that LED streetlights, wonderful as they are for energy savings, are broad spectrum, and light pollution from LED streetlights doesn't filter out as well by narrowband filters as it used to from, say, mercury and sodium streetlights. So here's that image of Cygnus that I took at f1.8, where the stars look pretty crappy. Here's the wide field version of that again. We see the coma, we see all the bat wings on the stars near the edges, near the corner, down here especially. Well, okay, if I made this really tiny, it would look great, maybe. So let's add a narrowband filter. And that's what we see. Now, I increased the exposure time a little bit. I went from 30 seconds to 60 seconds. If you're tracking on any sort of mount, even on a tiny little clock drive on your table, there should be no problem tracking for 60 seconds with a 28mm lens. But now notice, not only do all these nebulae pop out, you've got the North American Nebula up there, you've got Gamma Cygni Nebula, just the tons of nebulosity here from H alpha in the Milky Way. Also notice that those weird shapes, the stars, are not as bad anymore. Some of these brighter stars, we're still at f1.8, they have the coma, they have those bat wings, but you're suppressing so much of that starlight, and you're only letting one wavelength through. So all of those aberrations and artifacts that happen from different wavelengths of light not coming to focus at the same point, those are virtually eliminated by using a narrowband filter. Now, if I put this image into Photoshop and just do a contrast, something basic to it, get a little bit more of that nebulosity. Yeah, it's grainy. This is a single frame. These are all single frames, pretty much straight from the camera. I didn't do any stacking or post-processing. And just to get our bearings on what we're actually seeing, we have the North America and Pelican Nebula at the top right, Gamma Cygni, sometimes called the Butterfly Nebula, Crescent Nebula. We have the dumbbell in the corner, shows up as a nice little blob, and that is part of the Veil Nebula. So quite a bit going on in Cygnus. Now let's do that North American Nebula image that I had with the 100mm lens. Okay, I've got these still bloated stars. Let's add a narrowband filter to that. North American Nebula pops right out. No more bloated stars. The stars are pretty much pinpoint. And this is a pretty usable image. I can also up the contrast a little bit. Again, I should do some stacking. I should probably do more than one frame to get a nice noise-free image, but that's beside the point. The amount of nebulosity that pops up and the amount that I can actually stretch this image is much greater than that white light image, and I don't have those issues with my stars. So how do we use a narrowband filter with a DSLR camera? So I use what's called the clip filter system from Astronomic. It's pretty great. Most of the guys who have high-end telescopes with cooled CCD cameras have big filter wheels on the front. We can't really do that with our DSLR cameras, because if you put something between the DSLR and the lens, you generally can't communicate with the lens. Some of those lenses actually need to be attached to a camera body to focus. They are electronically focusing. And also cameras will not be able to focus. They are designed to focus with the lens connected to the camera body. If you're adding a lot of space in between there, you may not be able to come to focus at all. So what this does is it goes right in your camera body, and you can put the lens on top of that. And it originally came out for Canon. Now there are versions for Pentax, Sony, Nikon, everyone. So they have UV and IR blocking, light pollution, narrowband filters for all wavelengths. And to answer Carol's question earlier, I'd start with something like a CLS or a light pollution filter. And that just goes a long way to letting those emission lines from nebulae come out while filtering out a lot of that light pollution. An H-alpha filter is always a risk because your camera probably will pick it up if you expose long enough, but the question is how long do you have to expose? An O3 filter usually will work on any unmodified camera, but the amount of objects that are visible in O3 are just simply not as extensive as in H-alpha. Okay, so there has to be a catch, right? Well, yeah, there is. You have to use what EF lenses, or I don't know what the terminology is for Nikon, but these are lenses that are designed to be used for full frame cameras or crop cameras. Lenses that are specific to crop cameras are specific to crop cameras because they have a little element that protrudes closer to the chip, and that will not work. It'll hit the filter. Another disadvantage, every time you want to switch filters, you don't have that filter wheel. You got to take your camera off, pop the filter out, try not to scratch the sensor or anything. Make sure your camera attaches back without rotating your imaging train. Okay, so it's not a smooth process. And it's not automated either, but it will allow you to turn your fast camera lens into a narrowband or into a mini telescope capable of narrowband imaging. And again, the advantages are that narrowband can be done on moonlit nights from city skies. It'll hide some aberrations. You can get some really good results with it. The limitations are ideally you do want a camera that's sensitive to H-alpha. You'd need to buy at least 3 filters. You need to buy the filters, they cost money, and you have to expose with each filter before you combine the image. And you have to know what you're doing in terms of processing. So there are some specific advantages to using narrowband with the camera lenses, and we kind of saw that a lot of those aberrations from lenses do go away when using those narrowband filters. Well, okay, telescopes are designed to shoot at infinity, and there are great narrowband photos taken with telescopes. Okay, yep, and a telescope will almost always blow away a camera lens, but at what cost? One of them is speed. Let's say we have a typically fast refractor telescope is about f5.6. So if I'm using a lens at f2 versus 5.6, I'm going to get there in 1/8 of the exposure time. Now, I may not be as zoomed in as close to that object, but I will get there faster. So if I had an f5.6 telescope and I wanted to image an object and take 8 10-minute frames with each filter, so I got to get a red, a green, and a blue to make a color image, I need 240 minutes total exposure time. If I'm doing that with an f2 lens, I only need half an hour. And that can be huge, especially in summer when we don't have a lot of dark time outside. Or if I were giving this talk in winter, I'd say when it's cold outside and you don't want to be outside for more than half an hour. It also means that if you do have those 240 minutes to yourself, you can go a lot deeper. Now, a really quick note about those who use Astro CCDs. So those are usually a lot smaller chip size and they zoom in much more so your galaxy fills your whole field of view and it looks great. If you want to image those wider objects and use a camera lens, there are ways to do it. There are adapters that'll say let you use a Canon lens or a Nikon lens and attach it to your Astro CCD. You may have a hard time getting it to focus if you have a filter wheel in between, but again, you can use those clip filters. There are filters that will also fit in right over your CCD. You should beware of lenses that have focus by wire. Those are electronic focusers. So even if the lens has a manual focus instead of autofocus, it needs to be attached to a camera that is powered on to focus. If you have a lens like that, you will not be able to focus it with an Astro camera, so make sure it's manual focus. Upside is there are now many very fast, high quality lenses that are manual focus only. And pro photographers may not like them because they don't have autofocus and you can't shoot people or action that's happening really fast. If you're doing landscapes, they're great. They're also more than adequate for astro, where you really never need autofocus at all and you should focus yourself. So I'm going to conclude with just a couple of images. These are probably going to be a little wide looking because they have been stretched out to fit the screen. And these are all taken, I'm going to admit they're mostly taken with that big lens that I showed you because why not? But these are all taken with camera lenses, no telescopes involved. And the lens was just riding on a mount, which if a mount's big enough to hold a 40-pound, 50-pound telescope steady, it should have no problem holding a 10-pound lens even steadier. So I don't have to worry so much about auto guiding. I don't have to worry so much about my precision of tracking or balance or things like that. I can just get up and shoot. And most of these images, I've taken exposures of between 3 and 5 minutes to get them together. So this is Comet Neowise on its way out of the solar system, passing by several globular clusters. That's M53 next to it. This is M11. So this is a beautiful open cluster in the summer sky. And this is kind of a different perspective of an object that we think may not be suitable for a lens because you would want a telescope. So the whole cluster fills your field of view, right? Well, maybe not. There's actually a lot of interesting nebulosity and dark molecular clouds surrounding M11 that you would not see if you were using a telescope and were fully zoomed in. Here's the, oh, that one got blown up way too big. Here's the Andromeda Galaxy, perfect object for a camera lens. This one, I believe, was actually only 30-second exposures. Just tried to get a quick image in one night, and it's only about 8 of them. Ideally, you'd probably want to expose more than 8 if you want to get rid of all the grain. But again, Andromeda being so big, sometimes you can't get a telescope to frame it well, but it's a perfect object for a camera lens. This is the Elephant's Trunk Nebula. The elephant trunk is right over there. And again, a telescope might fit the entire elephant's trunk, while the 300-millimeter lens frames the entire nebula perfectly. And this was done as an H-alpha only image. Here's the Veil Nebula. Again, works great for a 300-millimeter lens, framed just about perfectly. To get this level of nebulosity with a telescope, I'd have to go hours and hours. Frankly, my tracking and guiding would not support that. Here I was taking exposures of between 4 and 5 minutes each. And I took about 16 in H-alpha, that's the red, and another 16 in oxygen 3, that's the green. And to finish off, here's the North American Nebula again with a 300-millimeter lens this time, using only narrowband filters. So this is done in more or less a close approximation of the Hubble palette that we always see, those green nebulae from NASA, where H-alpha is assigned to the green channel, sulfur 2 is red, and oxygen is blue. Now, it's not perfect. I need to revisit this one and work on it. You can still see that I'm shooting with a fast lens. There are a couple of blue halos around the brighter stars. There's a really weird thing going on here in the lower left, and that actually turns out was from the filter. You do need to be careful of internal reflections, but otherwise I'm pretty pleased with this image. And it was only about 2 or 3 hours worth of total exposures. Whereas if I was doing this with a slower telescope, I'd have to do this over several nights. And that's all I've got.
Great talk. Thank you very much, Martin. Hey, I'm sure
Dark.
anybody who's got any questions, go right ahead. I know it's one of the things, because a lot of us start out with unmodified off-the-shelf DSLR cameras like I did. And one of the interesting thing about the filters that I played around with when I was interested in, say, doing the Lagoon Nebula, and I wanted to try to get a little more H alpha out of my stock camera, I found one of those light pollution filters. I slapped one of those on there, and I was able to take longer exposures and get a little more H alpha. But the downside was, as I lost all the pretty dust, those light pollution filters can clip out some of the softer dust features that are, you like to get in your wide field views too. So.
Yeah, that is a downside. Sometimes you can get it back by exposing longer, but that's also why I recommend that CLS filter as kind of a good place to start, because then you can still get color images and you can filter out a lot of that light pollution and still get a color image just by doing one set of exposures and not having to go do 3 different sets.
But
CLS.
I think so, yeah. It's a different, I have something like it. We're not.
Hey, Martin. This is Dan Bush. I'm one of the new members, and it seemed like from your talk that you mostly use you're mostly using pretty much just Canon lenses. Do you, when you focus those, are you sort of doing set the autofocus initially and lock it down, or are you focusing those purely manually?
I do focus them purely manually. I found that the autofocus, especially when you're using a narrowband filter, does not work very well. So the autofocus does need quite a bit of light. If there's the moon or a planet nearby, the autofocus will get you very close, but a lot of times it is better to manually focus it. And with the aperture wide open, if you get a bright star or a planet is better in your field of view, you can use the live view and zoom in on the live view. If you don't have the live view, you can get as close as you can with your optical viewfinder. You take a test shot, and then you just have to do it manually. It is a bit of a process, and I'd always recommend between changing filters, always refocus. Because the filters are supposed to be parfocal, but nothing's ever perfect.
I've noticed I prefer, I have some Canon, so I have a Canon camera also, but I prefer like a purely manual focus lens, because those, when you've got an autofocus lens, the focusing dial is pretty flimsy and doesn't, necessarily hold very well. Whereas if you got a fully manual lens, the focus tends to be more robust. The other nice thing that it kind of has given me using manual lenses is that I can, if I don't want to spend a ton of money trying with a lens, you can get a lot of vintage stuff that is quite a bit cheaper than something that's autofocus. So the other kind of advantage that I see with Canon is because it's got a shallower mount than the other major mounts. It takes, just straight adapters and doesn't require anything adaptive. So I've got like this lens is probably older than half the room. This is an Asahi Pentax lens it's pre-1975 because it's a screw mount. But the focus is very, this is made of aluminum, and it's a very easy to get a very precise focus, especially because I printed off some Botnov masks that help with focusing the lenses. I've also got like a 200 millimeter Nikon lens that's actually exactly as old as I am. Because if you're going to get a newer lens at those focal lengths, then you're getting pretty pricey. The downside is they generally don't have quite as much aperture, and depending on the brand, the glass quality can be worse. But that's why, for Astro, I do like Nikon lenses, because then I can experiment with different vintage things. And if this one sucks, well, I think this one only cost me like $50. So.
Yeah, and sometimes there are a lot of gems from way back when, with really good glass that can be found at a discount. And again, that 300 millimeter, if I bought the newest one with image stabilization, it would be as much as a used car. But finding an old one and an old one that was really beat up at that, nobody's going to care how it looks like in the dark. I got it for about $800, so that was a pretty good buy. I will add to that manual focus lenses, especially if you're using a lens that's adapted to a different kind of camera. So if you're doing an Astro camera, for example, manual focus lenses are great because they are more tactile and they don't have that, especially with the newer ones, which do have autofocus and very sensitive autofocus. There can be a little bit of lag and it can be very difficult to get it right. So if you're going to buy a lens only for astro use, I would second that recommendation to get a manual focus lens.
You put your hand up. Don't the newer coatings help a lot with helping with the chromatic aberration and
They more help with glare. I haven't seen them necessarily help with chromatic aberration. There are more lenses do have ED or fluorite glass elements, which do help with that, but the coatings not necessarily.
okay.
And again, that's why it's better to have your camera, if you're going to modify it and you aren't interested in infrared photography, do an astro mod to get that H alpha and don't go any past that, because coatings that are designed for visible light are not necessarily going to work at other wavelengths.
One other thing about that, Carol, is that the coatings on the camera lenses are mainly designed for supporting terrestrial imaging, daylight imaging. It's really, they're generally not going to enhance or support low light imaging for the most part, because most DSLR systems aren't designed around that capability. It's not their purpose, although they can obviously do that. They're highly capable in low light settings, but almost the entire system is geared toward terrestrial daylight imaging. And when you think of why they built it, how they designed it, and going into long exposure, nighttime, photography is really pushing at the margins, the edges of what the systems are built for.
And in general, DSLRs as well are, they're not designed for such long exposures because of the heat. So a cooled astro camera will always outperform a DSLR. The question is just having two cameras and spending the money and taking a laptop out with you. So everything's pretty much a compromise there. I have a hand raised and I don't know how to.
Yeah, John.
John has a hand raised and I don't know how
Okay.
to address the raised hand. Sorry.
Martin, I'm using a Tamron 150 to 600 lens, and I want to use my crop sensor. I have great difficulty with the go-to getting the target into the field of view. Have you used the side-by-side or some targeting camera besides the regular DSLR?
So I have not used side by side, but generally when I do this, and it's only because I have a permanent setup or a semi-permanent setup, I put the lens, piggyback the lens on top of the telescope. So the telescope is doing the go-tos and the guiding, and the telescope's got a much narrower field of view and I can point more precisely. Yeah, and if I'm out in the field, so if I go out to Arizona, for example, for a conference and I want to take advantage of the night sky, then I don't end up doing go-to at all. It is kind of, you shoot and you frame your object by taking shots in there. Usually it's pretty easy at 100 millimeters or so. It gets progressively more difficult. Since you have a zoom lens, I would say start by getting your go-tos aligned at 150 millimeters and then zoom in and refine them further once zoomed in.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Martin, your comment about portability and practicality kind of reminded me of choosing to take out an accordion versus considering to take out a grand piano. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. Well, great talk, and thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone here learned a whole lot. So yeah, well done, Martin. And
Right up your alley.
Yeah.
it was a very enjoyable talk. Before we
I'm
close
always
up,
happy, by the way, always happy maybe in the future when things cool down a little and we get more dark skies, we can potentially do a little workshop at YRS, because it's part of it is in person and part of it is theory and, getting your hands dirty versus theory. And that's why I tried to show as many pictures straight from the camera as it were, without putting too much effort into getting it perfect. So everybody's got different lenses and different mounts and different skill levels, and I'd be happy at some point when things are a little slower to have a get together at YRS and do a little workshop.
And I imagine one thing I thought of when I was tinkering with the idea of doing some landscape imaging, like some folks in our club, there's a lot of talk, a lot of people like really using those Rokinon lenses for that, in part because they can get coma-free pictures, but still have a very short exposure where they don't need to track it all. But I heard a lot of them kind of complain, you have to sometimes you buy a new lens and it's not a very good copy. Some copies of the same lens from the same manufacturer might vary in performance. Sometimes can be kind of an issue. Have you had any issues like that buying new or used filters?
Well, so I think with that 28 millimeter, there are some people who love it, and there's some people who've used it for daylight photography, and they have gotten really great results on it. I put it on my stock camera on one of my older Rebels that definitely doesn't pick up much H alpha, so it's not getting any UV or IR. And even then, it's still soft and has a lot of chromatic aberration. There are some lenses that are worse designs in general. So that 50 millimeter 1.8, there's a 1.4 that costs 3 times as much, and all the reviews say it's not as good optically. So there are some that in general, they're just worse. There are others which may be like that 28, worse copy to copy. And the same with the Rokinons and some of those knockoffs. I'm saying knockoffs because they are bigger brands, but not the main suppliers, not Canon, Nikon, Pentax. Some of those do have more variation copy to copy. Upside is you can usually afford 2 of them for the price of 1 Canon.
And if you get a bad copy, you can always go with your vendor and have them send you exchanging for a new, better copy, hopefully.
John has another question.
I know, I was going to respond to Lawrence. I have the Rokinon 14 millimeter, and focusing was a bit of a problem because it focuses well past infinity. But there is a website that tells you how you can adjust it so that infinity is just crank the dial all the way to the end, and you reset the run of it. It won't focus past infinity, and it works really well. And that has been the problem that most people have had with that lens. So
very interesting.
Yeah, it's a great lens. I got some nice pictures from it. And very affordable.
Will, I don't know if Will is on here, Will Jarvis, he sent out a picture to the group a while back with the Lagoon Nebula, taken with that lens actually, and it was very impressive. And if you actually look at the details, the testing on test charts, lab testing of that lens, it is better than the Canon 135 f2. Now there's a little bit of a, maybe placebo effect of having matching Canon stuff and having that red ring, but you can't really argue with the results when something half the price is just optically superior.
I don't know, Martin, the red ring is everything.
If you set it to have a hard stop at infinity, are you compromising anything with temperature changes?
That is a good question. That's actually a very good question. It's something that I haven't experienced, mostly because I don't think I've left anything out enough. The really big one takes a long time to cool down, but I'm usually micro adjusting and changing filters, I think, before I see any issues.
Martin, I was talking about, he said about you could reset the Rokinon 14.
Oh, yeah, okay,
so
the micro adjustments.
So you could make, it sounded like you would make a hard stop at infinity.
It hasn't been a problem for me. At 14 millimeters, the focus isn't as fine. So it's not like it can be slightly off.
Mhm.
I don't think the temperature is a problem. I used it out west in the summer, and I've used it in November, and I haven't seen any problem with the focusing.
Yeah, Carol, I wonder two things. Obviously, 14 millimeters, that low focal length is going to be incredibly forgiving. You know, you think about 100 millimeter, 200 millimeter or above, the focus really is going to be affected potentially by thermal changes. And I've often wondered if that's why lenses, even prime lenses, focusing at infinity, so focusing on the stars for astrophotography, is never at infinity. It's always backed off just a tad.
Correct.
And it could be to allow for thermal equilibrium and thermal changes, because if you had it hard stopped, you're absolutely right. You could have your system go out of focus and not recover it, right? Because there's no play up above that hard stop. So it's always driven me batty that infinity is never actually at the infinity setting. It's always a hair back, you know, but I wonder if that's not why. It's a really interesting point.
So it's also for infrared. Most old lenses have an infrared focus mark that is past infinity. So most lenses are designed to have a specific, infrared photography was around well before DSLRs were. But since you couldn't see it, you'd have to kind of guess at the focus. So that infrared focus mark is designed so that you could estimate that infinity focus or any other distance with infrared. So that it does need to go past that as well. I think it's a question from Joel about astronomic filters. Are you on there? Are you
Muted, Joel.
muted maybe?
Yep.
Sorry, it didn't work. I'm sorry. Great talk. Thank you very much. I am confused about the operation of the plug-in astronomic filters. It was labeled H alpha 12 nanometers CCD. I had thought that that was an optical filter that lets in only light of the H alpha bandwidth. How does it work? Is it a CCD that with filters on it, like the red, green, blue filters we use? Can you clarify?
Right. So it is like the red, green, blue filters we use. Your camera chip is your CCD. In this case, it's a CMOS, but they're all silicon chips. So all you're doing is you're putting a little piece of glass in front of it that is letting through a very narrow wavelength of, in this case, red light. And the 12 nanometers is how wide of a wavelength it lets through. The narrower, the closer it'll get to that wavelength, and the more it'll filter out things like stars and light pollution. But that also brings up a real good point that I forgot to address. If you're shooting fast lenses, go with a wider filter. They're a lot cheaper, first of all, but when you shoot at very wide apertures, the wavelengths tend to shift. So H alpha shifts a little outside of that 656, and if you have a narrow filter, you may be getting less H alpha. So all of those images I shot were with 12 nanometer filters, which is great because the 12s are about 150 each. The 6s are about 350 each, and 3s are close to 1,000.
Why do they put the letter CCD on that plugin? It isn't really.
Oh, it's just, I think what it means, because most astronomical cameras are CCDs, that just means that the filter is designed for CCD use rather than for visual use, for imaging rather than visual. And in the same way, I have an O3 filter that I use at the observatory that's a CCD filter. Our eyes can pick up O3 just fine since it's a green wavelength, but it is used for CCDs. Filters for visual use usually let in a little bit extra light, and they don't have the IR blocking because our eyes don't see infrared. So those filters for visible use, they're cheaper to make. And they are cheaper because they don't have that extra blocking for infrared. But a camera will see it, and it will cause focus issues.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Martin, the light pollution filter clip-in that you mentioned do you think you get a similar results to the light pollution filters that screw on the front of the lens?
You'll get better because the ones that are designed for imaging. So I mentioned the CLS filter. You would ideally get the CLS CCD version. I don't know why there are two if they're designed to be only used in cameras, but there is a CLS and a CLS CCD. So you should get similar results. But if you have visual filters, you can always try screwing them or just putting on the, sometimes you can just get them to rest on the front of your lens. So lenses can be 52 millimeter or 58 millimeter threads. Most astronomical filters are 48, but you can usually get step rings that'll allow you to screw a 48 millimeter filter onto a 52 millimeter camera lens. So if you have it, that's kind of the whole point here. If you have it, try it out and see if it works. You might have a good combination. Especially if your camera is not modified for infrared, then it may not, the leakage from those extra wavelengths may not be enough to cause an issue. And sometimes the filter is better than no filter.
Well, I've seen a lot of photographs of the screw-on lens filters for light pollution, and I honestly don't like the results. It makes a very purple, very magenta photo, and I don't find that being a better look. So
yeah, you have to do white
something.
balance.
Yeah, exactly. And I've always found that even no matter what type of filter it was, if it was a light pollution filter or a pollution filter designed to reduce light glow, it always tints the color a little bit. And then you have to I use software that'll do a white balance using the white stars. And that helps a lot. But that's a lot better than having to rebalance your color because of a lot of red sky glow or something like that too.
And a lot of those filters were originally designed to filter out sodium light, which is just one wavelength in the yellow-orange. So they just kind of block out yellow-orange light and let the others through. So you will see pretty much magenta is what you're left over with. Now they don't work so well because LEDs give out quite a bit of blue light and red and green light. But also the ones, when they screw out further from your lens, it can cause reflections and some other type of aberrations. That's why the clip filters I've generally found are a little better than the screw-on filters. And the upside is you only have to get one size that fits into your chip. If I had a light pollution filter or God forbid an H-alpha filter that was big enough to screw over every one of my lenses, I'd have to get tons of different sizes. And I can only imagine a 70 millimeter versus a 36 millimeter H-alpha filter that I'd be broke pretty quick. So I haven't used much of those. I use polarizers for daytime photography, and that's about it. That's the benefit of that clip filter system, is that you have filters for your camera regardless of what lens you're putting on it.
Or your telescope if you want to use it with a telescope someday.
Absolutely. You put your camera on a telescope, it uses those same filters. There's no, it doesn't matter what kind of optics you have on it. And then you don't have to buy an extra filter wheel. And yeah, the only downside is, like I said, having to go in there and change it every time, but it depends. It's versatility versus cost.
You know, astro-modifying your DSLRs has come up a couple times, and there is another option, which is what I did with my Canon 5D Mark II. I had it astro-modified, but I also had a new UV-IR cut filter put in. So it opened up the range that lets in the H-alpha, lets in 4 times more red, but it still blocks out the low infrared and the UV. So that chromatic aberration problem that Martin demonstrated wasn't as significant because it's still blocking out the UV and preventing the IR bloat as well. So that is another way. You don't have to get a full pass astromodification where it lets everything in. You can have it the stock filter replaced with one that lets the red in that you want, but still blocks out the UV and the rest of the IR.
And generally, I can also tell you that by the color, because again, topic for a different talk, but every wavelength of light has its own color and DSLRs respond pretty evenly to them. I can tell you that those orange kind of bloats from the stars, those were above about 780 nanometers. So the mod that Jeff has would just give you 400 to 700. So lead and H alpha and S2, which is a little redder than H alpha, but it's almost always used in tricolor narrowband. And your camera is still 100% usable for daytime photography.
That's what I was
Photos may appear a little redder, but you just solve that with a white balance.
Who do you
And-
recommend? Who do you recommend going through for astromods generally?
I'll let Jeff answer
Yeah.
that one for astromods. I'm going to tell you real quick, the full spectrum I got off of eBay, and I got it off of Dslr on eBay because he was the only one that used a fused silica window. So I have protection for the chip, but it's fully transparent, and I've tested in my lab down to near vacuum UV lengths. So it's as good as you get. The downside is no anti-reflection coating. So it's scientifically very useful, but the pictures are going to be less pretty.
Yeah, I had my astromodification done by Hap Griffin, and he did a great job. Came back, works as advertised. There's an outfit, I forget the name of it, in Colorado that has very, very dodgy reviews, but a lot of people use them. And very mixed results in terms of people being satisfied or people saying that they broke their camera. So Hap Griffin had good experience with him. There's another individual, I forget his name, but you can search it very easily, who also does quality work, very dependable, has done, hundreds, if not thousands of astromodifications, and they're reliable. So I think Hap is in South Carolina, if I remember.
Martin, I have a question about filters.
Mhm.
Filters come from cheap to very expensive. I mean, just
Yep.
lines themselves. And remember a couple of years ago, you checked out some of my filters, my beta filters.
Yep.
And they were rather sloppy bandpass. And so I'm curious if you found it all, or anybody here who's tried different filter brands, whether the more expensive ones are actually better in the sense that they're more square wave bandpass rather than being sloppy looking like the Rocky Mountains.
Well, so
Whether
one of
there's
these
anything
days we
noticeable.
have to have a proper narrowband talk, and I already talked with Jeff about that. So we're going to do that separately, and we'll talk all about filter band passes and the effects of filter band passes. But I will tell you, those betas were actually all right compared to some older Astrodons that I've tested. Now, Astrodon is, the BMW of filters, but the way some of the filters work with the layering and the anti-reflective coatings and the dichroic coatings is that they make some compromises with the layers that you do have, just because of the physics of depositing everything on there. The way the filters are built, you will have small leaks. And some of those Astrodons had pretty bad leaks. My Astronomics also have pretty bad leaks. I can take photos in H alpha and still get some blue stars. Well, the blue stars are because they have a leak around 1,000 nanometers. Most people don't have a camera that goes to 1,000 nanometers. Mine's full spectrum, so it will pick that up. So the question is whether they are designed for full spectrum or for astro use. And most of them, even the big expensive manufacturers, are just designed for that general astro use of 400 to 700, maybe a little wider than that. They'll all have slight IR leaks. It just depends on how sensitive your camera is. So I haven't tested any of the budget ones that are coming up, like the Optolong. If anybody has them, I have a pretty expensive spectrometer in my lab. If you're okay without your filters for a while, I don't mind taking them and testing them. But some of the more expensive ones do still have compromises. The bandpass accuracy, that also depends on the filter angle. I may have not had them completely square, but I'll have to look at that data and get back to you. But I have found different I found different results from different manufacturers, and not in the area you would think. That sometimes it doesn't make sense to pay for an Astrodon. And I saw Bob's hand go up.
Yeah, I actually did a direct comparison of a ZWO H alpha versus an Astrodon H alpha. And I did do it with the spectrometer. I actually did it by imaging the exact same object and then looking quantitatively at the signal to background of the nebulosity versus the just sky glow background. And it was a pretty pronounced difference. So at least in that one case, I think it really did make a difference. I'm happy to point you to the data. I published it up on Cloudy Nights if you go there, but
Nice.
I can point you to it if you want.
Yeah, I would add, Jürgen, so part of it is about the bandpass in terms of the cost, and like almost everything in optics or in astronomy, you do get what you pay for, right? One of the other big things with the narrowband filters that you might be paying for is if they're parfocal. And that's a huge plus if you can get a set of filters that are parfocal, where when you change filters in your filter wheel, your focus does not change. You do not have to refocus because the filters are parfocal, and whoever mounted them in your filter wheel mounted them properly so that they can achieve that. So Astrodons, I don't remember whether or not they're
supposed to be.
They're supposed to be. Astronomics are, at least the kind of higher end astronomic line are parfocal, and that's a huge plus when, like Martin was saying, you have to shoot 3 channels in order to get a color image. Every second, every minute you have is precious, and having to refocus between filters, especially if you aren't using an autofocuser, is no fun, and it burns a lot of time.
And I'm going to add to that too, that your filters may be parfocal. In the case of the Astronomics, they are, but if I don't mount them exactly the same in the camera, forget about them being parfocal.
You got to mount them properly.
Also, you can have perfectly parfocal filters, but you can always have a slightly achromatic system rather than an apochromatic system, and you will still have to focus just because you have a variance in however minute, a variance in where those wavelengths are coming together, which will manifest itself with a very narrow filter, but won't in a white light image. And I also want to throw out one more quick thing to add to the astro modification of the cameras. I recently picked up a 7D Mark II last year, and I've been shooting with it, and it won't shoot sulfur 2, but it'll shoot H alpha just fine. And I believe the Canon 6D Mark I has also been tested. So a lot of those cameras, again, it depends on the camera, and there are certain astro versions too. There was a Canon 60DA, which had specifically H alpha, but there are a lot of cameras out of the box that may pick up H alpha pretty well. And so you might not have to do the astro modification at all, especially if you're worried about, tinkering with getting somebody into your camera and things like that. So it's always worth testing it out, what you have first before you start modifying.
And what's the best way to test that?
You'd need an H alpha filter, and you need to take an image. But if you want to test yours, we can, like I said, we can get together at YRS and we can try it out. The other way to do it is in, I don't want to say in the lab, but in the lab you can do a lot of things. There, if you're interested, there are ways. We can get something together.
Is there an online source that lists which cameras would have some?
Yeah. And I'm not sure actually what the source is. I believe it was Clark. Oh shoot, what's his last name? He's pretty famous amateur astronomer, Clark something. Clark Vision is the website, but he's done tests, and that's also where he's confirmed the 7Ds and the 6Ds do pretty well unmodified.
Well, all right, great discussion.